Hi class. Okay, so we are on chapter 3 and 4 of the Magic Treehouse, number 24, Earthquake in the Early Morning. So if you remember, Jack and Annie got to San Francisco and they had felt what they now know was an earthquake, and it like shook and then it stopped and then it started shaking again. So that's what happened. That's where the book or the last chapter ended, where the shaking just had stopped. So it says, a cloud of dust billowed around Jack. He could hardly breathe. He couldn't see, but he could hear Annie coughing. Jack opened his mouth to call to her, but the dust filled his throat. Jack! Between coughs, Annie shouted his name. Jack! I'm here, he said hoarsely. I think I'm in trouble, she said. Jack tried to sit up. He hurt all over. His clothes were ripped and covered with dirt. His cap was gone. Where are you? He called. Here, said Annie. Jack started to stand, but he fell down again. His legs were like rubber. Where? He repeated. Jack cleaned his glasses, then looked around, but he still couldn't see Annie through the thick haze of dust. I fell into the ground, said Annie. Jack crawled in the direction of Annie's voice. Keep talking, he said. Here, she coughed. Here. Jack felt a ledge with his hands. He looked down into a huge crack in the street. Through the dust, he could see Annie right below him. You found me, she said between coughs. I'll pull you out, said Jack. He grabbed Annie's hands and he tried to pull her out of the crack, but she was too heavy. I can't do it, he said. Bring me something to stand on, Annie said. Maybe I can get myself out. Jack stood up and stumbled away from the crack. He gathered an armload of bricks, and then he went back to the crack and handed them down to Annie. One by one, Annie carefully stacked the bricks on top of each other. I need more, she said. Jack ran to get more bricks. He was afraid there'd be another earthquake and the crack would close with Annie inside. He handed the bricks down to her. Hurry, he said. I am hurrying, she said. At last, Annie finished stacking the bricks. She stood on the stack with her bare hands and she slowly pulled herself up. So you can see her coming out of the crack in the ground from the earthquake. And normally when earthquakes happen, this doesn't happen. This just happened to be a really, really big one. So normally this doesn't happen. Jack helped her stand. She was covered with dirt. Her stockings were torn. Her knees were skinned. Are you hurt? Jack asked. A little scraped, said Annie. How about you? A little shaky, said Jack. Actually, he was very shaky. Me too, said Annie. I think San Francisco just had a really huge earthquake, Jack said. He coughed. His throat was clogged with dust. Annie coughed too. What's the book say? She said. Jack pulled his research book out of his leather bag and his hands were trembling. He could hardly turn the pages. I'll find it, said Annie. She took the book from him and found the picture of a torn-up street, and she read aloud. At 5:13 a.m. on April 18th, 1906, the people of San Francisco were shaken awake by one of the biggest earthquakes the United States had ever known. Some called it the Great Shake. No wonder we feel shaky, said Jack. I wonder if a lot of people got hurt, said Annie. They looked around. Through the dust-filled air, families were stumbling out of their crumbling houses. They were all barefoot and still wore their night clothes. Some babies and small children were crying, but strangely, the grown-ups were all silent. They just stared up at the torn-up street and crumbling houses. Everyone must be in shock, said Annie. I know how they feel, said Jack. He gazed at the rubble all around them. He didn't know what to do. He couldn't think clearly. Annie looked at the book again. She read aloud. Just after the earthquake, broken chimneys, stoves, and lamps caused terrible fires. The fires raged for 3 days, nearly destroying all of San Francisco. Over 28,000 buildings burned down. That's terrible, breathed Jack. In the distance, a cloud of black smoke was rolling through the sky. The fires are starting, said Annie. Maybe we should just leave, Jack said in a panic. He wanted to get out of San Francisco before the fires spread. We can't, said Annie. We have to find our special writing for Morgan's library, something to lend. Let's find it fast, said Jack. He and Annie started walking through the rubble and they stepped over piles of bricks and chunks of concrete and broken glass. They passed fallen lamps and twisted trolley car tracks. They saw houses leaning to one side and people hauling their things out to the street. We can't worry about our mission now, Annie said. We have to help. So there they are, looking down the street of San Francisco with the fires starting, you can see. And the fire started, remember, because the earth was shaking and it knocked over. Back then they used candles and lanterns with fire in them. So when the lanterns fell over, it started fire in the houses. Help how, said Jack. He was so shaky he didn't think he could be much help to anyone. What about them, said Annie. She pointed to some men frantically dragging bags out of a building and piling them into a horse-drawn wagon. Annie ran over to the wagon. What are you doing? She asked the men. We're trying to get these bank bags down to the harbor, said the wagon driver, so a boat can take them out into the bay. Why? Asked Jack. So we can save everyone's money from the fires, the man said. He pointed at the sky. The cloud of smoke was growing bigger and blacker. Can we help? Asked Annie. We're done, said the driver. You kids run home to your parents, then get out of the city. Jack wished he and Annie could ride with the driver down to the bay and be safe from the fires too, but he could see the wagon didn't have room for them. Good luck, said Annie. Don't forget what I told you, the driver said. Then he and his horses took off. The wagon turned onto the main street and disappeared over the hill. I wonder who we can help, said Annie. Jack took a deep breath. I don't know, he said. Maybe I'll take some notes. Jack pulled out his notebook. In a wobbly handwriting, he wrote, Bank money, wagon to bay, then boat. Hey, what's the story? A woman asked. Her voice sounded urgent. Jack looked up. A man and a woman stood in front of them. The woman wore a long dress and carried a notebook. The man wore a suit, and he carried a big camera and a three-legged stand. This is what the old-fashioned cameras looked like. What story? Said Annie. The story with the bank. My name's Betty. I'm a reporter, said the woman. For television? Asked Annie. What's that? Said Betty. Never mind, said Jack. He whispered quickly to Annie. She's a newspaper reporter. TV hasn't been invented yet. Oops, said Annie. So what's the story with the wagon that just left the bank? Betty asked Jack and Annie. Jack looked down at his notebook. They're going to save the money by taking it to the bay and putting it on the boat, he said. Good reporting work, Sonny, she said. Get a picture of the bank, Fred. The photographer set up his camera on the stand and he put his head under a black curtain and took a picture. Got it, said Fred. As the photographer packed up his equipment, Betty turned to Jack and Annie. Go home and get your parents, kids, she said. Fires are burning out of control. We know, said Annie. By the end of the 3 days, the fires will burn down nearly all of San Francisco. Betty looked curious. How do you know that? She asked. She's just guessing, Jack said quickly. Pretty gloomy guess, said Betty. Tell your folks not to catch the ferry. Thousands are crowding into the ferry building. Go to the Golden Gate Park. Thanks for the tip, said Annie. Thanks for the story, said Betty. Then she and Fred hurried away. Jack and Annie looked around. Now many people seemed to be fleeing their homes. Some were going up the hill, some were going down. An old woman was pushing a wheelbarrow filled with pots and pans. A girl was carrying a suitcase and a cat. A boy was carrying a bird cage and a fishbowl. They're all going in different directions, said Annie. I wonder where Golden Gate Park is, said Jack. Maybe we should go there. Let's see if there's a map in our book. Jack looked in the research book and he found a map of San Francisco. Where are we now? He said. As he looked for a street sign, he saw a man carrying an armload of books out of a beautiful building. The man put the books into the back of the horse-drawn wagon. What's he doing? Asked Jack. I bet he's saving those books, said Annie. Saving books, said Jack. He loved books. For a moment, Jack forgot his fears. He forgot about trying to save himself. We'd better help, he said. Come on. All right, so that is the end of chapter 4. We'll start chapter 5 and 6 tomorrow. I hope you guys are having a good day. And, I was going to tell you guys, so this is the last book I've ever read with Magic Tree House. So when we get to the next book, which I actually have, I'll show you guys that actually at the end of this book, it will be a book I haven't even read yet. So I'm super excited once we get through this one to start the next one because it's brand new for me. So as I'm reading it, it'll be the first time I will have heard the story too. So anyway, I hope you guys are having a great day and I will see you tomorrow. Bye.